I'm slightly alarmed to see some real musicians here, but, so hopefully what I'm going to say tonight won't be a disappointment to you, and do feel free to pick me up in the questions later if I say anything that you think is wildly inaccurate. But let me thank Arthur for his invitation to speak this evening, and let me congratulate the Martins Guild on fantastic series of talks that have been held over the past year. It's a really great thing that you've been doing, and so impressive to see the wonderful list of topics that have been covered. But all good things must come to an end, so here I am. Let's just do the screen sharing. Okay. So this evening's topic is music and change ringing. No, you're leaving it on. Sorry, we have a lighting issue. So I don't claim to be any sort of authority on music and ringing, but I did have a musical upbringing. Part of my degree at the University of Birmingham, as Arthur's already said, was in music, and much of the other part of my degree at the University of St Philip's, where the Vice Chancellor was Rod Pipe, was in change ringing. I can claim to have composed a number of methods and peals which others have found enjoyable to ring. And whilst this isn't itself a kite mark for their musical quality, repeat performances and peer recognition are at least indicative of worthiness in some sense. Now, some of you might be wanting to ask, is change ringing really music at all? So let's start at the very beginning, which, as Julie Andrews would say, is a very good place to start. So this is a dictionary definition of a bell, and as you can see, it says a hollow metal object, typically in the shape of a deep inverted cup widening at the lip, that sounds a clear musical note when struck, especially by means of a clapper inside. So that phrase, a clear musical note, I think is really important. And furthermore, if we were to look at the definition of a musical instrument, it is any device for producing a musical sound. So the instruments on which we ring are indeed musical. Bells are percussion instruments, which means that the sound is made by hitting them like drums, and in particular, they are tuned percussion, like a glockenspiel, timpani, a piano, or tubular bells. Some versions of Psalm 150 include the words, "Praise him on the well-tuned cymbals," and those well-tuned cymbals we might reasonably decide are bells. Bell ringing of any sort, including change ringing, is therefore undoubtedly music. We as ringers are making that music by ringing the bells, and that makes us all musicians, whether we consider ourselves to be so or not. The music that we make is played, sorry, that last mistake, played, not played, rung on the world's heaviest and loudest unamplified musical instrument. And most performances are heard by hundreds, if not thousands of people. But what is the music that we make, and what makes one piece of ringing sound better than any other? The music of change ringing is constrained by the mechanics of our bell installations and their physical properties. Notwithstanding the Birmingham School of Bell Ringing exercise of ringing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which is designed to teach and fine-tune bell control, we don't tend to ring recognizable tunes. What comes from our towers isn't something that most members of the public will recognize and want to sing along to. I've lost count of the number of times we've shown non-ringing visitors into our tower and had to explain that no, we can't ring Amazing Grace, which to them seems like a perfectly reasonable request. Indeed, most of us explain change ringing as a sequence of mathematical permutations and rarely talk about music at all. We even refer to our bells by number rather than note. You'd be shocked if your tower captain asked you to take hold of the F sharp or the B flat. Although there was a ringer at Smethwick a few years ago who played viola in the CBSO and who would ask when listening hard to try to pick out her bell in rounds, "Am I the D sharp?" If we are to understand the music that we make as change ringers, we must first consider what the various elements of music are. melody or tune, timbre, which is the character or quality of the sound the instrument produces, rhythm and speed, dynamics, how loud or soft the music is, and harmony. If you listen to most music, Baroque, classical, jazz, rock or pop, these elements all play a part. For example, an orchestral piece will likely have chords with different layers of different instruments juxtaposed over one another. There will be interesting and irregular rhythms and syncopation, dotted notes and rests. There will be melodies with the same note repeated. There will be multiple players of multiple instruments, each capable of many different notes, and for some instruments, like the piano, for example, multiple notes at the same time. The climax of a piece may be met with a crescendo as the music gets louder, or the delicacy of a pianissimo, very soft and gentle. So how does this relate to ringing? Well, the music we make is more akin to a soloist, unaccompanied. We ring rather than play a single instrument, yet paradoxically, we do it as one band or team, with each ringer responsible for just one note of that one instrument. There is no harmony, at least not intentionally. Chords are positively frowned upon. The timbre of our bells is determined by the way that they are tuned, which is a subject for a whole talk in itself. As with most percussion instruments, we can't change how our instrument sounds by the way we ring it. We ring as best we can without any syncopation, in a rhythmical yet repetitive and burgeoning sequence of notes, varying only the order of the notes and with an occasional gap, a bit like taking a breath, to signify the start of a new handstroke row. The volume of our instrument doesn't change. It's constant, both inside and out, even if individual bells might unintentionally, due to their mechanics, be louder or softer than others. The music that we make is therefore quite constrained, with only really the melody, which itself is constrained by there being only between 3 and 16 notes to play with, alongside the stringent rules of change ringing and the speed that can be varied. And these restrictions make it unique, or at least very unusual, within the world of music. But at the risk of drifting into cliche, it is music that is loved by many, ringers and non-ringers alike, for its quintessential, can't even say the cliche word, quintessentially English sound. Although almost all rings of change ringing bells are tuned to a diatonic major scale. Diatonic major scales are perhaps best explained by the example of a ring of bells in the key of C. All of the notes would be the white notes on a piano, with the tenor tuned to the note C, and there would be no black notes. A diatonic major scale is also what Julie Andrews was teaching the children in her song Do, Re, Mi. We start off by ringing the bells in order, from the highest note to the lowest down the scale. Scales are an integral form of many forms of music and are runs of adjacent notes increasing or decreasing in pitch. They are also the bane of the lives of many people learning a musical instrument, as they will be required to play scales for practice, usually being played up the scale and then downwards again. So what you can see on the screen now is the scale of C in musical notation, and played on a piano, this is what it sounds like. And again, just for luck. What we're seeing and hearing here isn't a million miles away from the Birmingham ringing school exercise called switcheroo. But it isn't something we do in the tower as a matter of course, mainly because we're constrained by the physics of the bells. Why is rounds defined as ringing down the scale by default and not up the scale, which is backgrounds? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think most people would agree that rounds sounds more like something is finished than backgrounds does. But I fully admit that that may just be because we're conditioned to hearing that. Anyway, it is the way it is. We start and finish almost all of our ringing with rounds, and there's something about that which, to my ears at least, sounds complete. Now, this is what rounds on 8 looks like in musical notation, if your bells happen to be in the key of C. Note in particular the time signature, which is the 17 and 8 on the left-hand side of the stave. 8 means that there are the divisions within the bar are quavers, which are eighth notes, eighth of a breve, and 17 means there are 17 of them. So all the bells ringing once at handstroke and once at backstroke, followed by the 1 bell gap at handstroke lead. Now 17/8 is not a time signature you'll find very often in much other music. It's fairly irregular and you'd struggle to march or dance to it. I did actually find a few pieces in 17/8, but they're fairly avant-garde, and you're unlikely to find them on your Spotify playlist. This is just another peculiarity of our particular style of music. So we talked about major scales, and major scales do tend to sound happy, more joyful, whereas minor scales sound sad or mournful, very broadly. So as if to prove the rule that all rings are in major keys, there are a few rings of bells in minor keys to be found. Almost all rings of 5, but uniquely, there is a combination of bells at Worcester Cathedral that can be rung as a minor 10. This wasn't by design. Various clock and carillon bells had been hung for ringing alongside the ring of 12, and it wasn't until the 1950s that it was realized the minor 10 existed. This 10 is now rung on specific days like Good Friday, New Year's Eve, and Remembrance Sunday to mark sadder occasions. And the sound is particularly haunting, not least because it is so unfamiliar to our ears. I'm just going to play a video now. That I don't know how jumpy the video itself will be, but it's the sound that's the important thing. Okay, I think you'll agree that sounds really quite unusual, quite haunting. In fact, we rang a set of handbells this last Sunday, tuned to exactly those notes, and it was very unusual indeed. Anyway, compare and contrast. Compare and contrast that with this much more joyous sound of a ring of 12 in a major key. Now you may recognize some of the ringers in this clip. Okay, so in case, well, you can probably see on the screen, that's actually the Birmingham band ringing at Great St Mary's in Cambridge when they won the 12 bell there 3 years ago. But the point I'm trying to illustrate really is just how joyous, how happy that sound is compared to that haunting and sadder sound that we heard from Worcester. I'm indebted to Nigel Taylor, who used to be the bell tuner at Whitechapel Bell Foundry, for providing me with some insight into when bells started to be tuned to scales. It seems that some bells were tuned to scales at least as early as the 12th century. In terms of ringing peals, it had been thought that all pre-Reformation rings had been tuned to minor keys, although two rings dating to the 15th and early 16th centuries, one in London and one in Ipswich, seemed to disprove this. It is, however, unlikely that any rings of more than 5 bells tuned to a major scale were installed until change ringing started in the first half of the 17th century. It was really change ringing that drove that innovation. Rings of bells that were tuned to scales prior to this point were rung in other ways, including being hung with half or 3/4 wheels. Now, this illustration from a Bible published in 1148 shows 8 small bells, and I don't know whether you'll be able to see, but actually they have their note names on the bells themselves, so C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, indicating that they were tuned to a diatonic major scale, and that's back in the 12th century. But obviously those bells, as you can see, the chap there is hitting those with some hammers, and there's some bloke playing some other random instrument that looks like a cat. But anyway, without 4 wheels, the bells couldn't be rung full circle, and therefore couldn't be controlled sufficiently to allow changes to be rung. The advent of full wheels changed this, allowing for much greater definition in the ringing than, as Wilfred Wilson describes it, the indiscriminate jangling that had gone before. At first, just rounds was rung, and then, in order to relieve the monotony, they tried swapping adjacent pairs of bells over, pretty much along the lines of the chord changes we ring today. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how change ringing evolved, but if you're interested, Wilfred Wilson's The Art and Science of Change Ringing on Church and Handbells and Ernest Morris's History and Art of Change Ringing are well worth a read. Suffice to say that the change ringing that we have today has developed from these simple early steps, and all the methods that we ring, irrespective of complexity, have their roots in the premise of swapping adjacent pairs of bells. It's worth noting that in method terms, complex doesn't necessarily mean more musical. More difficult methods are something to challenge the brain, not necessarily to increase the amount of music, although there are clever things that you can do splicing multiple methods together, which can be very musical indeed. Some of the simplest methods, plain bob major and Grantzer triples, can be very pleasant to listen to. Indeed, these are a few of my favourite things, probably because they are so simple. So, sorry, you've got to look at me now. What elements make up a musical piece of ringing? Well, I think there are 3 elements which have an impact on how pleasant a piece of ringing is to listen to. The first of these is the striking, which includes the evenness of the gaps between the bells, the consistency of the speed, and the overall structure or rhythm of the ringing. For me, this element is far more important than the complexity or the musicality of the method or composition being rung. Any ringing, however musical, won't sound good unless it is struck well. But any piece of ringing rung with accuracy and style might reasonably be regarded as musically noteworthy. Speed is an important element of striking. The speed of the ringing shouldn't be so fast that the bells become unmanageable and difficult to strike, but it shouldn't be too slow either, for much the same reasons. People talk about the right speed for the bells, but I tend to think that there can be quite a range of these without being either too slow or too fast. The pursuit of striking accuracy is something of a paradox. The human ear is conditioned to be able to distinguish between something that is performed by a machine and something played by humans. There needs to be something organic about a piece of music to make it sound interesting and to avoid it being bland, sterile, and boring. Take, for example, a piece of ringing rung by computer using the software Able. It will be absolutely accurate, with no bell sounding even a millisecond out of place. I'm not saying it will sound bad, far from it, but it won't sound interesting. Very small inaccuracies, milliseconds of difference in players in an orchestra playing a chord, help the human ear to identify something that is played by humans. And there is something about those tiny inaccuracies that gives a richness to the sound. And as an aside, there's a note of caution here about relying 100% on a computer to judge a striking contest. Yes, the strikeometer will give you an absolute judgment of the accuracy of the ringing, but from the perspective of a musical performance, you will always need some human ears to adjudicate. Notwithstanding that, the strikeometer is a fantastic thing, and I fully commend it to anybody wanting to judge a striking contest. The second element is the instrument you are using, the ring of bells, because it's that which will make the actual sound. This is, of course, more difficult to affect. In most cases, the bells are as they are in your tower and can't be changed without a lot of expense and effort. However, a ring of bells that sounds like a set of badly tuned dustbins is unlikely to be pretty to listen to, however good the striking is or how musical the ringing is. Ringing poorly on the best ring of bells in the world will be similarly disappointing. Most of us are lucky to be blessed with rings of bells that sound good or better, and the variety of styles of bells, from medieval to modern, is all part of the rich oral tapestry of change ringing culture. It's certainly true that good striking on poor sounding bells is achievable, and I've often gone to towers with low expectations because of the quality of the bells and come away pleasantly surprised because we've rung them nicely. Both the accuracy of the striking and the sound of the bells you're ringing on may change your own subjective view of what is and isn't enjoyable to ring and what sounds more or less musical. The final element is that of the method or composition itself. What then makes a musical method or composition, and what measures do people use to decide? We're now into the bell ringer's definition of musicality, but I don't think that makes the use of the word musical any less appropriate. Why, for example, is Beethoven a generally more well-known and regarded composer than, say, Brahms? Why do more people like Ed Sheeran than James Blunt? These are subjective choices that people make to say they prefer one over another. The same is true of methods and compositions. Ask 10 ringers what they consider to be the most musical method, and you'll get a number of different answers. Music is in the ear of the beholder, and different people will listen out for and prefer different things. However, there are a number of features that are generally agreed to be worth aiming for, and it is those yardsticks that we as ringers use to define what we consider to be musical or not. These objective measures can be used to rate methods and compositions against each other, but we as individuals might want to apply our own criteria in the same way that we might say we prefer Mozart to Haydn or ABBA to One Direction. Some people will prefer even bell methods, but many have a preference for odd bell methods rung with the tenor behind. There can be something pleasing to the ear about the tenor providing that steady beat at the end of every row, very much like the beat of a bass drum. Indeed, covering on the tenor is colloquially known as drumming behind, for, I believe, that very reason. Ringing the tenor behind requires skill and precision and can be very satisfying when done well. It is good for teaching a learner how to ring rhythmically, as long as everyone else is ringing rhythmically too, and the quality of the tenor ringing can make or break a piece of doubles, triples, caters, or syncs. It's also another of my favourite things to do, because I don't have to think about ringing the method and can concentrate 100% on striking the bell. Anyway, I asked a random sample of people to tell me what they thought was the most musical method. I asked my band at St Wilfrid's in York, as I couldn't think of a more random bunch. Now, let's have a look. So this is what I got back. So people told me on all numbers of bells, although actually I was the only respondent who responded with anything on any royal method. So there we are. But all the way from Grancer triples up to Bristol Maximus and Littleport Maximus, with a number of things in between. And those ones that I've highlighted in blue are the ones that people came back to again and again. Now, these were the responses from only 14 people. So I don't know quite where they misunderstood. Tell me your one favourite method, but I'm very grateful for the responses anyway. But yeah, so the methods that did appear on multiple people's lists were Grancer, particularly triples and caters, Stedman triples, caters and sinks, double Norwich and Bristol major. So within each of these methods, there are specific elements that people will listen out for. Almost all of them taken from rows you'll be familiar with from ringing call changes, rounds itself, titums and queens. Let's look at rounds first. You've maybe heard the term roll-up mentioned, even shouted out by a conductor during a touch when they're anxious that the musical rose might somehow go missing. And it is terminology which is applicable to ringing on all numbers 8 and above. I'm going to use 8 bells for my examples. Traditionally on 8, a roll-up was a row that ended with 7 and 8, preceded by any 2 of 4, 5 and 6. These rows were known as combination roll-ups or crews, and are still used today by some people as a yardstick of how musical a composition is. In the last 30 years or so, the term roll-up has become used to mean a run of 4 or more consecutive bells at the beginning or the end of a row, commonly 5, 6, 7, 8. In other words, the end of rounds down to the tenor, but now also including runs of any 4 bells, for example, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 7, 6, 5, 4. These so-called little bell roll-ups have become a very common measure, especially in compositions on 10 or more bells, not least as they give all the bells an opportunity to get involved in some of the music. These little cascades of bells are good to listen out for, are generally agreed to sound nice, and give the ringers something to focus on. Certainly in brisk ringing on 10 or 12, you might think they sound a bit like a waterfall, and they can be exhilarating to take part in. They are also, of course, all subsets of rounds or backgrounds, and that familiarity is perhaps the root of their appeal. A good example to illustrate this is the first lead of Bristol Surprise Major, and these are the figures for that first lead of Bristol Major. You'll often hear a touch of 3 leads of Bristol Major rung at a practice or on a Sunday. It's both musical and repetitive, which means there's not too much to learn, and some people will tell you it's their favourite method, as we've seen on that table before. So let's have a look at the rows. I've highlighted all the runs of 4 consecutive bells at front or back. And as you can see, there are quite a few in just 32 rows. We have, I have a 1, 2, 3, 4 after just 2 rows here, and a 5, 6, 7, 8 after not very long, and 2, 3, 4, 5, and a 2, 3, 4, 5 again. And that's to win the first half of the lead. So we've only been ringing for about 30 seconds, and we've had a number of what people would consider to be musical rows in that time. Rather less in the second half of the lead, but there are different styles of music, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So let's have a listen to that lead and just see if you can pick out the musical rows and follow it. So we go all the way down the first column, then all the way down the second column.
Go Bristol. seconds.
And my thanks to the Von Pipe family ringers for that piece of ringing that I recorded especially for this talk. One of the beauties of the construction of Bristol Major is not just how many musical rows there are, but what happens before and after those rows. The way the bells moved away from and then back towards a roll-up builds a sense of anticipation. And the roll-up itself is the ringer's equivalent of the fortissimo at the end of a crescendo in an orchestral piece, followed by the decay or diminuendo afterwards. The structure of Bristol also avoids any sense of monotony. If, for example, you were just interested in hearing lots of roll-ups, well, simply you could just ring rounds, but that wouldn't be very interesting. You could construct a method where 5 and 6 and 7 8 just kept dodging with each other, so you'd get alternately 6 5 8 7 and 5 6 7 8. Methods like that have their place, but it isn't such an elegant way to generate the musical rows. It's more of a sledgehammer approach. Similarly, methods where musical rows seem to appear out of nowhere don't allow for that sense of anticipation, and you might easily miss the roll-up because your ears hadn't been alerted to listen out for it. There are lots of methods on all numbers that generate runs of bells, both in their plain courses and in compositions for quarter peals and peals. And these are things that lots of composers focus on these days. Method choice, especially for longer pieces of ringing, is really important. You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. You could do a lot worse than look at Project Pickled Egg. Related to run music is a thing called near misses, particularly in caters and sinks. A near miss is rounds with a single pair of bells the wrong way round. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8. These are fun to include for a composer and conductor and to hear, and may tease novice ringers into believing they've actually heard rounds and that the peal is finished, which can be a mean trick after 3 hours of ringing. So that's runs of consecutive bells that are a subset of rounds. There's more I could say about which runs I think sound better on different numbers of bells, but I'll leave that for now as something for you to think about. Next, we'll look at music around titums. Titums is so called because the big bells are interspersed with the little bells, giving a titum, titum, titum effect. What is known as the titum's position is particularly common in odd bell ringing, caters and above. Now, I'm guessing that most of you, or many of you at least, will have been to a practice when the conductor has said, "Go Stedman," and then 2 seconds later said, "Bob." The reason for this is that starting Stedman with the bob puts the bells straight away into the titum's position and causing, on 12 bells, 8, 9, 10, and 11 to course down from the back in order, creating the same titum, titum, titum effect as the titum's change itself. This is perhaps best illustrated by another example. So here is some handbell ringing done by members of the Cambridge Youths at a music festival in Utrecht. You'll hear some rounds to start with. The conductor will say, "Go Stedman," and then Bob. And then about 35 seconds into the recording, you'll start to hear the back bells interspersed with the front bells. This carries on for a while as the bells make their way down to the front. Hopefully you'll be able to pick it out. And the rows are on the slide as well. So starting with rounds, and as you can see from the purple highlighted cells, this is where the bells start to, the back bells 8, 9, 10, 11 start to be interspersed by those front bells. Okay, here we go. just looking at the size of the audience there, that's a pretty cool thing to do, standing up in front of an audience that size and ringing. But it's the fact they can see the audience that's scary. When you're up a tower, there's an audience much bigger than that you can't see. Anyway, hopefully you're able to pick out the Tittum's music in that. That video, incidentally, is available on the Central Council's website, so do go back and find that if you want to hear it again. Tittum's music has also become a bit more common in even bell compositions in recent times, and there is a particular course where the bells course in the order 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, which has earned the name the Mega Tittum's course because all the bells are following each other around. I have to say I'm not a big fan of that, but it has certainly become popular in some compositions. Finally, we come to music around queens, which is, as I'm sure you know, all the odd bells followed by all the even bells. Musically, all the odd bells are either a major or a minor third apart, and the same is true of the even bells. Queens as a row is perhaps one of the most recognisable after rounds. Indeed, a non-ringing relative of mine once heard some bells ringing queens and said to me, "Oh, it sounds like there must be a wedding going on." It was instantly recognisable to her. Cascading thirds, like queens, and pairs of bells a third apart, again create a pleasant sound. If we were to go back to our example of Bristol Major from earlier, we'd see a number of rows where the bells come together in that way. So back to our Bristol Major. Well, part of it seems to have gone missing. There we are, that's where it is. So the rows highlighted in blue all feature pairs of bells a third apart. For example, 2 and 4 and 1 and 3, or 6 and 8 and 5 and 7. These are also rows not very far away from those which contain runs of consecutive bells, those roll-ups we were talking about, and are part of that building of anticipation that I talked about earlier. So let's hear this recording again, not to blow David Pipe's trumpet for him, but this time to focus on the rows in blue and the effects they make.
Go Bristol. Second.
It was almost as good as the first time, I thought. So hopefully you were able to pick out those rows in blue, and just to hear how they build. Some of them build that sense of anticipation. 2, 4, 3, 5 before 2, 3, 4, 5, and 3, 2, 5, 4, 3, 5, 2, 4. They're not going very far away, but they're just varying that tune a little bit before coming back to the more recognizable musical row when the bells are in order. From a compositional standpoint, the actual Queen's change is, in most methods, quite a long way away from most of the other music that we are likely to want to include. It's also a bit of a one on its own, a sparkler that it's nice to have, but possibly not worth the effort to get to it. There are some other combinations around musical thirds like 7, 5, 6, 8 and 7, 4, 6, 8 that you will see included in a number of compositions, quite common, especially in triples and major. If you want to read a little more about music and change ringing, Graham John has written a very good wiki page, and I will, when this gets shared, Arthur, if we can share the link to that, I think people will find it really interesting. I used it at least in part for the basis of some of this talk.
Yeah, of course.
So to finish, a question: do you have to be musical to be a bell ringer? I think this question sits side by side with the question, do you need to be good with numbers to be a bell ringer? For me, the answer to both questions is no, but it helps. What is far more important is the team performance. There is something inherently satisfying in the achievement of a shared goal, and the way that a band of ringers works together with precision and skill in much the same way as an orchestra plays together to become more than the sum of its parts. Something that sounds good outside to the hundreds and thousands listening is key to good change ringing, and as musicians, that should always be our aim. Whatever anyone says, the public really can tell the difference between good and bad ringing. And finally, as Julie would say, when you know the notes to ring, you can ring most anything. Just some credits before we go. As I've already mentioned, Graham John's Music and Change Ringing Wiki. My thanks also to the Worcester Cathedral Guild and Mark Regan for the recording of the Harmonic Minor 10. As I've already said, there's a couple of videos from the Central Council, the Birmingham Band at Cambridge, and the Cambridge Youths at Utrecht. Nigel Taylor, who provided some great historical information. Those two books by Wilfred Wilson and Ernest Morris. The St Wilfrid's York Bell Ringers, who aren't a random bunch at all. They provided some really useful feedback, and the Von Pipe family ringers for the recording of Bristol Major. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening, and thanks for turning up tonight. And any questions will come now via Arthur.
David, thank you very much for that. You started the talk by saying all good things must come to an end. Well, I think they haven't come to an end yet. So thank you for that. Really excellent talk. You treated us to a social history as well as obviously a musical analysis, and I particularly liked all of the links to The Sound of Music. I think there's an award, isn't there, if people can accurately count up the number of times you made a reference to it tonight.
Yes, if you like. I don't think I know the answer myself, actually.
That could be a challenge for someone. Just to remind people, again, if you have any questions, either type them into the chat box or you can unmute yourself or wave furiously, and I will do my best to coordinate things. We did have a question, David, that came in. That actually links in really well, I think, to what you were talking about at the end of your talk there. The question's from Simon. And he says, accepting the premise that ringing is a form of sort of process music, should this have implications for how we rehearse? Would, for example, would ringing benefit from adopting more of a proven rehearsal and training techniques, perhaps used in the world of classical music? I just want to get your thoughts on that.
I think that's really interesting. I think that we as ringers often have a little bit of what's the word I'm looking for? We consider ourselves to be amateurs, which I think is really unhelpful, because actually we are often, almost always, a bunch of very skilled people. But the way that we organise ringing is very much at a hobbyist level, and that well, I don't think we're going to change that culture anytime soon. That's quite a that's I think the way it is. But whether you could actually formalise practices and have them more on the style of an orchestral piece, could you actually practice? I mean, I've been members of orchestras, and you've practiced little sections of the music over and over again until you get them right, and then put them back in the whole piece. And I think that'd be really quite difficult to do in ringing. Anyone who's tried to do that and started ringing from a row that isn't rounds, it's so unfamiliar. It's really difficult to do, and it actually takes you longer to get into the rhythm of ringing whatever row it is you're starting from than it would do to actually ring the whole piece. So I don't know. I think that it'd be nice if we thought of ourselves as more than amateurs, certainly, because we have so much skill that we're worth more than that. But whether you could formalise the practices, I don't know.
Of course, it's interesting with ringing, isn't it, in practices, because as you sort of hinted at, we're so public, and so whereas mistakes that happen to an orchestra in private, obviously ringers, the concept of making drastic mistakes in ringing, obviously is harder. So our opportunity to practice is potentially different there anyway.
Yes, and I think my point about the public knowing the difference between good and bad ringing, I expect if you got them to turn up to the 12 bell contest, they might struggle to tell you which was the band in last place and which was the band in first place, because actually the standard is high, and that's true of a lot of our ringing. It's of a relatively high standard. It's the point at which you do start introducing chords and quite variable rhythm that I think the public will suddenly start to say, well, that doesn't sound very good. But I think that those are much rarer these days, and I think a lot of the ringing that we all do is of a much higher standard than that.
I was really interested, David, in what you're talking about, was the sort of social history behind ringing and historical. And I wonder what your thoughts were about sort of bell restoration projects and how important sort of musicality is when we think about bell restoration compared to, say, sort of a historic ring of bells that might have history behind it, but the ring of bells is not particularly very musical, versus the importance, therefore, of sort of overcoming that and actually musicality when we think about bell restoration projects.
I think you have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis, and there are some beautifully old sounding rings of bells, and I don't know quite how to quantify that. St Paul's Cathedral bells have a growl to them, which is hard to quantify. But I don't even know how. To my shame, I don't actually know how old those are. But they have a unique quality which I don't think you'd want to lose. Bells cast by Ruddle have a particular quality. Bells cast by Gillett, like the bells at St Wilfrid's in York, have a particular quality to them. I think where you've got a bit of a mix of founders in any one tower, and you've got bells that really do sound like tuned or badly tuned dustbin lids or dustbins, then there's less of a case. And I'd rather see those bells preserved elsewhere in the tower, as say as clock bells, and better tuned bells be part of the ring. But that's not to say that actually a lot of these bells don't become these rings of bells are more than the sum of the parts. You can be ringing an 8 and they sound perfectly nice, excuse me, and then you ring them individually and think, well, these are not such great bells. They don't need to all be great bells in order to make a nice ring. My general view, though you talked about bell restoration, is that we would be better in these enlightened days spending more money on training ringers than restoring bells, and to make up that gap between the number of ringers that you have and the number of bells that we have. I'll get down off my soapbox now.
And David Babcock says 1878 or thereabouts.
Thank you. Okay. So not all that old.
Sorry. Vicky shared sort of, again, linking back to the previous question around sort of practicing around, we do this occasionally at Birmingham 12-hour practices to practice like the 4th and 5th lead of Cambridge Maximus, but it's difficult to sign anything other than rounds. You can get there through shortcuts, but it's quite difficult.
Yes. Yeah, and you sometimes end up spending more time explaining the shortcut or getting the shortcut right than actually practicing the thing you want to, and these things can be counterproductive.
Well, definitely, if you have me in the band, that's definitely the case. Ellie asked, what's your view on the musical compositions put together by modern composers that incorporate bells into a performance?
Yeah, I think those are really interesting. And one of the things I didn't touch on, although I threatened to earlier in the week, was talk about some compositions that have been inspired by change ringing. And those of you on Facebook might have seen I posted a question about 2 pieces by Peter Maxwell Davis, one called Stedman Doubles, one called Stedman Caters. They claim, and I have to say I'm not a huge fan of Peter Maxwell Davis, but they claim to have been in part inspired by the structure of Stedman. But I think if you listened to them and didn't know what they were called, you'd you'd spend a million years guessing that they were called Stedman doubles or Stedman caters. The couple of things that well, we've done a couple of things like Ellie mentions in York, actually, ringing a number of the bells around the city and incorporating trumpets and singing and other things. And they've been really interesting to take part in. They aren't change ringing, but they're an interesting diversion. We also did something similar at Durham Cathedral, where they had the bells linked to lights, and each bell lit up a different part of the cathedral, both inside and out. And that too was an interesting thing to take part in. But of course, there are other pieces that include or can include church bells, like Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, and I think that would be a fantastic thing to take part in, especially if you manage to get some fireworks as well.
And David Baverstock asks, what about styles of bell music other than change ringing, like the Veronese style, which builds up to rhythmic chords?
To be honest, I don't really know much about it. Perhaps that sounds like another good topic for this series of talks. But what I do know about it is that chords are positively encouraged. And
I'm not sure. I saw David waving his hands. I don't know if that was an offer to talk, David, or a David Baverstock. This is, or a don't ask me. I'm not sure. I believe. I hope I'm not about to put him on the spot. I believe Will Bosworth is keen on asking a question or two.
Hi, David. Thanks for a very nice talk. I have to first of all put on record my my protest that you granted Beethoven as a better composer than Brahms, but we'll pass that.
It's all subjective preference. That was my point.
I think I've got a zillion questions. I think my first question would be about. I feel like often we work very hard to justify ourselves as musicians sometimes, and yet you get all these efforts to put ringing in classical music, and as you say, they all I don't know of a really great one. I can't think of how you could really put change ringing and mainstream Western classical music together. Shouldn't we be celebrating our differences a bit more? And I think this also goes back to Simon's phrase of process music. I think ringing is a completely different kind of music. I wondered if you could talk about that.
And you're absolutely right. It certainly is a different type of music. One of the things I thought was interesting about that video of the Cambridge youths ringing handbells in Utrecht was at a music festival, and they were demonstrating exactly the type of music that is common to us. And we didn't get as far as the end, where the applause was rapturous, as you might expect. But I think I've been in other situations where we've rung handbells in front of an audience and in front of a congregation often, and people tend to be rapt by it. They just aren't familiar with the sorts of things that go on in the tower. I think part of the problem there in celebrating what we do is the actual situation we find ourselves in. We're those faceless people up the tower. No one sees what we do. No one sees us. Lots of people in the street assume it's a machine making the noises or some such. So yeah, I think we could do more to celebrate what we do. How whether you'd want to integrate that with any other instruments is another matter. I don't think that's what you were suggesting, but in terms of us being part of an orchestral concert in some way, I don't know whether that would work. I don't think that necessarily answers your question, but
it wasn't really a question. It was just a sort of musing on celebrating difference rather than trying to justify ourselves. Yeah.
I think the best way is to put ourselves in front of an audience, and realistically, the best way to do that is by ringing handbells, which is, of course, what we've seen earlier.
We had a couple of comments coming in actually whilst you're having that discussion. So Richard Johnson says ringing is like some 16th century music. I don't know if Richard wants to expand on that. Or... No.
Could I just say something?
Oh, hi, Christine.
Hello. You might like this quote. The scene, Ludgate Hill, one Sunday in June 1914, with the bells of St Paul's in full swing. A passing taxi suddenly pulls to a halt. Inside, the young Igor Stravinsky, visitor to London for his new opera, The Nightingale, is listening intently and scribbling notes on a scrap of paper. He turns to his companion and exclaims, "That is really the ideal way of making music. A man pulls a rope, the bells do all the rest. The music is not in him, it lives in the bells." So that was from Stravinsky. So
it's interesting, and of course this comes back to what I was saying about how many people do hear what we do, and how even if it's not the sort of music that people are familiar with, they recognise it and they like it. But most people like it. I mean, I don't know how. I don't want to even think about the people who move into a house next door to a church and then complain about the bells. But actually, I rather suspect that if you asked, did a Mori poll, Ipsos Mori poll, you'd find that more people like bells than not. But hey, who knows?
Yeah, Simon Ridley also says, he's not sure why we consider ourselves not mainstream. Thousands of people listen to bells every week, which kind of supports your point.
But I think we have a culture and a marketing problem. I think that I don't know whether Simon Linford's still on this call, but he I don't know what the Central Council marketing team is doing about it. But I think we have an image issue that we could do with trying to solve. And it's an issue that, if you go to the United States, for example, doesn't exist. People think that ringing's amazing and want to be part of it, not as I think lots of people in this country think, it's just a little bit peculiar.
Super. Thank you, David. Will, anything else you wanted to?
I was just going to say, I think the connection with the church it may be relevant there in our public relations issues. Sadly, very sadly.
Yes. Yes. Sorry.
My next question would be about tuning systems. I wonder if you could talk about about your thoughts on how different tuned bells really affect the music, because I mean, you talked about scales, and the experience of listening to a scale on differently tuned instruments makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Do you mean about the quality of the tuning, or the major versus minor, or?
No. In terms of the sort of the style of old style tuning versus new style tuning. You hear 300-year-old bells, and all the intervals within them are completely different.
Yes, and certainly, I mean, I suggested to Arthur before everybody joined that there might be a talk in this from somebody like Nigel Taylor or Andrew Higson or someone similar who might be able to talk about how bells are tuned now and how they used to be tuned before, and before, well, back in medieval times, they would simply chip bells bits out of the bell using a hammer and chisel to make them a different note, which clearly isn't ideal. Nowadays, with Simpson tuned bells, where all the different partials are very accurately tuned in most cases, then bells sound a lot brighter, I suppose. But there is something great about hearing an old style ring of bells that hasn't been messed with modern tuning, and inevitably not all of those rings of bells are as good as modern rings, and you won't find as many good old rings as you'll find good new rings, but it's all part of the rich variety, I think.
Super. I will just take this opportunity to market next week's talk and actually the upcoming talks, and then we'll see if there's any sort of final questions or final comments people want to contribute. Dave, you can take this opportunity to have a quick look in the chat box. There's a couple of bits of thanks coming through for you, and well deserved it is too. So as you know, we've got a series of talks going from now until mid-May. I've just put into the chat box a shared drive. You'll be welcome to join any of the talks. Obviously, if you're on our mailing list, you get the weekly emails anyway. Otherwise, just email smgcbr@gmail.com and you'll be welcome to join us at any of the talks. Next week, we're joined by Tom Wesley, who's come to talk to us about bell casting, something that we haven't sort of had a talk on yet. So looking forward to that one. Again, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. But again, have a look at that Google Drive. You'll be welcome to join any of our talks. I don't know if there are any sort of Richard Andrew had a question, David, around probably some scope for investigating and trying out musical chord changes other than the well-known ones like Queens and Tittums, perhaps on higher numbers, so 10 and 12, and of course 16 at the Bullring. And what are your thoughts on possibilities here? I know
it's interesting, isn't it? How often do you ring on Sunday morning and actually say somebody calls some chord changes and they'll go for Queens or go for Tittums or on 12 maybe go to Whittingtons. The Bullring's one on its own, I think, because it takes so long to get anywhere that the style of chord changes there is somewhat different. I think I'm all for experimentation. I'm all for trying things out and try things out on the piano first and see what you like the sound of, and then go up the tower and call them. Would be my thoughts on that. But I guess also that there's probably a reason why things like Queens and Tittums, notwithstanding the musical elements of them, that have become popular. They're quite easy, formulaic to get the bells into those positions, just by the way you do the swapping. But also, people I think they sound nice. So and they do sound well. They sound nice to me. I don't know. Do they sound nice to you? I'm not sure.
We have some interesting compositions. I think Alan Burbage and others have sort of put some quite interesting, again, very much on the idea of not worrying about change ringing, but different chord changes and composing what they sound like together, which we've tried at the Bullring a number of times. It's always quite fun, a bit different, and sound quite interesting.
Yeah, can I just pick up Simon Ridley's question about Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and so on? Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I'm also, one of the things I also thought about talking about was serial music, where composers would take the 12 semitones within an octave, within an octave, and arrange them in a particular order, and then only ever play them in the piece in that order, which is almost a mathematical way of thinking about classical music. So turning it back that way. I don't think there's much of a parallel to draw there, but it's certainly a peculiarity of that style of classical music, that you're using numbers in a sense to drive the way a piece is composed, which is, I guess, what we're doing when we're ringing.
Super. And Ellie's put a final question in, which I think is quite a nice way to finish on. Maybe we need a poll for this to get more views. But the question is, what's your choice for the most musical change?
Yeah, interesting. I really like Tittums on 16, and I appreciate that's a bit niche because many of us don't get the opportunity to ring on 16. But the point about that is that the back bells that are interspersed with the front bells are actually ringing rounds on 8. They're ringing rounds on the back 8, and so it sounds like rounds on the back 8 being rung quite slowly with all these little bells in between, and I really like that. There's something about different styles of music, about roll-ups and whether they're on 4 bells, 6 bells, 8 bells, and some of these compositions of Splice where you get lots and lots of roll-ups all over the place. It can be quite mesmerizing. But so having some variety, and I think that's what David Pike tried to do with his particles peals, is you ring quite a lot with lots of runs, and then you do go into this section where the bells go into the megatitums coursing order. So you have got, pardon me, that variety before you go back to the roll-ups again. So variety is the spice of life, and so trying to include different things in competitions, I think is great.
Super. David, thank you for tonight's talk. You know, I'm always massively impressed with the amount of research and preparation that people put into these, and yours is absolutely no different. You know, you've gone and asked questions on social media and of your band, and you've got other people to prepare things. You know, the amount of preparation you put into this clearly is extensive. So on behalf of myself and on behalf of St Martin's Guild, thank you for that. It's been a fascinating insight into music, social history, the sound of music, as well as you know, a whole range of things. So thank you so much for coming along and doing it. There's lots of thanks coming into the chat box, so please make sure you have a look at that. It's obviously very well deserved, and I appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks Arthur for asking, and let's hope I don't have to do it again. It's very stressful, you know.
I'm going to stop recording, and if people want to sort of stay around for a few minutes and ask David anything else, I'm sure he'd be happy to do so.
Yeah, yes, of course. Thanks, Arthur.